Section 134 of The Haunted Homes and Family Traditions of Great Britain. Smith Hills Hall. Smith Hills Hall, Hollowell, Lancashire, the seat of Richard Henry Ainsworth, Esquire, is one of those lovely and picturesque ancestral abodes for which England is famous. It is replete with the subdued charms which only antiquity can generate, which no amount of expenditure, however lavish, can create. The origin of the splendid old mansion is lost in the proverbial mist of ages. Historians retrace its story to the time of the so-called Saxon Heptarchy, and, as if in confirmation of this remote ancestry, an ancient gateway bears the date of 680. Less mythical records of the place and its various owners are carried back to the early part of the 14th century, when the lord of the manor of Smith Hills was a William Radcliffe. Subsequently, an heiress by marriage carried this manor and the estates into the Barton family, and from that family it passed by purchase in 1801 into the possession of the Ainsworths, by whom it is still held. In a description of this ancient mansion, recently given in the Bolton Journal, it is said, "Smith Hills Hall requires to be sought for. It lies far from the road, which curves in its course, thus effectually hiding it from the public gaze. When reached, the full beauty of the building is not at once seen, but passing through an arched gateway, the south front is disclosed to view. Emerging by the gateway with the 680 inscribed above it, the visitor finds himself in the antique courtyard at the head of a beautiful lawn, reached by a flight of steps. Turning from the view before us to admire the architecture and appearance of the old building, one is impressed with the air of calm repose which seems to rest over all. The old Lancashire lath and plaster style of building is everywhere apparent. Black beams, placed obliquely on a ground of dazzling whiteness, with ornamentations of quatrefoil standing out in charming relief, present a pleasing picture of the taste of our ancestors in matters architectural. The ivy clusters lovingly over porch and walls, the effect on the 680 gateway being especially lovely. The old-fashioned domestic chapel forms a wing to the east of the block, and around this, too, clusters the loving parasite, the healthy hue of green blending charmingly with the stained windows, rich in design, and commemorative of the heraldry of past and present of Smith Hills. The writer then proceeds to speak of the interior of this fine old place, rich wainscotings, its oaken mouldings, and of the other relics of the past, but then recurs, as must all who mention Smith Hills Hall, to the mysterious footprint, to the far-famed bloody footstep seen on the stone in the passage leading to the chapel. Above the indelible footstep is a plate bearing the inscription, "Footprint of the Reverend George Marsh, of Dean, martyr, who was examined at Smith Hills and burnt at Chester in the reign of Queen Mary." The legend connected with this marvelous relic of the past is thus given in the local journal. Robert Barton, at one time owner of Smith Hills, was the famous magistrate before whom George Marsh, the martyr of Dean, appeared in 1555, to answer for his Protestant faith. Tradition describes Mr. Barton as a zealous bigot, and alleges rude treatment on his part towards the martyr. It was after the examination before this worthy that, it is stated, Marsh, descending the stairs leading from the court-room, stamped his foot on the stones, and looking up to heaven appealed to God for the justness of his cause, and prayed that there might in that place remain a constant memorial of the wickedness and injustice of his enemies, the print of a man's foot remaining to this present day as such constant memorial. A tradition in the place, a resident of Smith Hills Hall informs us, says the stone bearing the imprint of the mysterious footprint was once removed and cast into a neighboring wood. The ghostly noises became so troublesome in consequence that the stone had to be restored to its original position. Nathaniel Hawthorne, the famous American novelist, at one time enjoyed the hospitality of Smith Hill's Hall. The legend of the Bloody Footstep made an intense and lasting impression upon his mind, and in 3 separate instances he founded fictions upon it. He saw the Bloody Footstep, as he says himself, with his own eyes, and from the lips of his hostess heard the particulars of its origin, either from what he heard or imagined, about this weird symbol of a bygone crime. He gave, in his romance of Septimus, the following story is that of the Bloody Footstep. On the threshold of one of the doors of Smith Hill's Hall there is a bloody footstep impressed into the doorstep, and ruddy as if the bloody foot had just trodden there. And it is averred that, on a certain night of the year, and at a certain hour of the night, if you go and look at the doorstep, you will see the mark wet with fresh blood. Some have pretended to say that this appearance of blood was but dew. But can dew redden a cambric handkerchief? Will it crimson the fingertips when you touch it? And that is what the bloody footstep will surely do when the appointed night and hour come round. It is needless to tell you all the strange stories that have survived to this day about the old hall, and how it is believed that the master of it, owing to his ancient science, has still a sort of residence there, and control of the place, and how in one of the chambers there is still his antique table, and his chair, and some rude old instruments, and machinery, and a book, and everything in readiness, just as if he might still come back to finish some experiment. One of the chief things to which the old lord applied himself was to discover the means of prolonging his own life, so that its duration should be indefinite, if not infinite, and such was his science, that he was believed to have attained this magnificent and awful purpose. The object of the Lord of Smith Hill's Hall was to take a life from the course of nature, and nature did not choose to be defrauded, so that, great as was the power of this scientific man over her, she would not consent that he should escape the necessity of dying at his proper time, except upon condition of sacrificing some other life for his. And this was to be done once for every 30 years that he chose to live, 30 years being the amount of a generation of man. And if in any way, in that time, this lord could be the death of a human being, that satisfied the requisition, and he might live on. There was but one human being whom he cared for. That was a beautiful kinswoman, an orphan, whom his father had brought up, and dying left to his care. He saw that she, if anyone, was to be the person whom the sacrifice demanded, and that he might kill 20 others without effect. But if he took the life of this one, it would make the charm strong and good. He did slay this pure young girl. He took her into the wood near the house, an old wood that is standing yet, with some of its magnificent oaks. There he plunged a dagger into her heart. He buried her in the wood, and returned to the house, and as it happened, he had set his right foot in her blood, and his shoe was wet in it, and by some miraculous fate it left a track all along the wood path, and into the house, and on the stone steps of the threshold, and up into the chamber. The servants saw it the next day, and wondered and whispered, and missed the fair young girl, and looked askance at their lord's right foot, and turned pale, all of them. Next, the legend says that Sir Forester was struck with horror at what he had done, and fled from his old hall, and was gone full many a day. But all the while he was gone, there was the mark of a bloody footstep impressed upon the stone doorstop of the hall. The legend says that wherever Sir Forester went, in his wanderings about the world, he left a bloody track behind him. Once he went to the king's court, and there, being a track up to the very throne, the king frowned upon him, so that he never came there any more. Nobody could tell how it happened. His foot was not seen to bleed, only there was the bloody track behind him. At least this unfortunate lord deemed it best to go back to his own hall, where, living among faithful old servants born in the family, he could hush the matter up better than elsewhere. So home he came, and there he saw the bloody track on the doorstep, and dolefully went into the hall and up the stairs, an old servant ushering him into his chamber, and half a dozen others following behind, gazing, shuddering, pointing with quivering fingers, looking horror-stricken in one another's pale faces. By and by he vanished from the old hall, but not by death, for, from generation to generation, they say that a bloody track is seen around that house, and sometimes it is traced up into the chambers, so fresh that you see he must have passed a short time before. And this is the legend, said Hawthorne, of the bloody footstep, which I myself have seen at the hall door. It will be seen, however, how widely different is the story told by the great American romancist as that given by the owner of Smith Hill's Hall, and believed in by the tenants around. Whether the author of Septimus really had any traditional authority for his version, or whether he evolved the whole recital from the depth of his imagination, it would be difficult to say.
Section 135. Souter Fell. Harriet Martineau, in her description of the English lakes, writes, "The ascent of Saddleback may begin behind Threlkeld, up a path which the villagers will point out. But an easier way is to diverge from the main road some way farther on, by the road to Heskett, near the village of Scales. The hillside path is to be taken which leads along Souter Fell, by the side of the stream which descends from Scales Tarn. This part is the very home of superstition and romance. This Souter or Soutre Fell is the mountain on which ghosts appeared in myriads at intervals during 10 years of the last century, presenting the same appearances to 26 chosen witnesses, and to all the inhabitants of all the cottages within view of the mountain, and for a space of 2 hours and a half at one time, the spectral show being closed by darkness. The mountain, be it remembered, is full of precipices, which defy all marching of bodies of men, and the north and west sides present a sheer perpendicular of 900 feet. On Midsummer Eve 1735, a farm servant of Mr. Lancaster, half a mile from the mountain, saw the eastern side of its summit covered with troops, which pursued their onward march for an hour. They came in distinct bodies from an eminence on the north end, and disappeared in a niche in the summit. When the poor fellow told his tale, he was insulted on all hands, as original observers usually are when they see anything wonderful. 2 years after, also on a Midsummer Eve, Mr. Lancaster saw some men there, apparently following their horses, as if they had returned from hunting. He thought nothing of this, but he happened to look up again 10 minutes after, and saw the figures, now mounted, and followed by an interminable array of troops, 5 abreast, marching from the eminence and over the cleft as before. All the family saw this and the manoeuvres of the force, as each company was kept in order by a mounted officer, who galloped this way and that. As the shades of twilight came on, the discipline appeared to relax, and the troops intermingled and rode at unequal paces, till all was lost in darkness. Now, of course, all the Lancasters were insulted, as their servant had been, but their justification was not long delayed. On the Midsummer Eve of the fearful 1745, 26 persons expressly summoned by the family saw all that had been seen before, and more. Carriages were now interspersed with the troops, and everybody knew that no carriages had been or could be on the summit of Souter Fell. The multitude was beyond imagination, for the troops filled a space of half a mile, and marched quickly till night hid them, still marching. There was nothing vaporous or indistinct about the appearance of these spectres. So real did they seem that some of the people went up the next morning to look for hoof marks of the horses, and awful it was to them to find not one footprint on heather or grass. The witnesses attested the whole story on oath before a magistrate, and fearful were the expectations held by the whole countryside about the coming events of the Scotch rebellion. It now came out that two other persons had seen something of the sort in the interval, viz. in 1743, but had concealed it to escape the insults to which their neighbours were subjected. Mr. Wren of Wilton Hall and his farm servant saw one summer evening a man and a dog on the mountain, pursuing some horses along a place so steep that a horse could hardly by any possibility keep a footing on it. Their speed was prodigious, and their disappearance at the south end of the fell so rapid that Mr. Wren and the servant went up the next morning to find the body of the man who must have been killed. Of man, horse, or dog they found not a trace, and they came down and held their tongues. When they did speak, they fared not much the better for having 26 sworn comrades in their disgrace. As for the explanation, the editor of the Lonsdale Magazine declared, Volume 2, page 313, that it was discovered that on the Midsummer Eve of 1745 the rebels were exercising on the western coast of Scotland, whose movements had been reflected by some transparent vapour similar to the Fata Morgana. This is not much in the way of an explanation, but it is, as far as we know, all that can be had at present. These facts, however, brought out a good many more, as the spectral march of the same kind seen in Leicestershire in 1707, and the tradition of the tramp of armies over Helvellyn on the eve of the Battle of Marston Moor. We have allowed Harriet Martineau to tell her tale in her own words without comment, but on reference to our chapter on Edge Hill in the first series of this work, something pertinent to the theme will be found.
Section 136. Swinstead Hall. In the picturesque valley of the Washburn, high up on the right bank, in the parish of Otley, stands Swinstead Hall. It is a large building in a kind of Elizabethan architecture, says Mr. William Grange, and on its first creation would, doubtless, be considered a great, grand, and glorious mansion, with its many gables and multitudinous windows. The greatest wonder is to see it here at all, in such a lonely place. It has been built in a substantial manner, and at a heavy cost. The ground plan is that of an irregular quadrangle, with a projecting wing on the north-west. The south front is the most interesting portion, 3 stories in height. The central rooms, the fronts of which project some distance from the main line on the first and second floors, are each lighted by a window of 20 lights, divided by a transom, which gives 40 openings in all. Indeed, that side has much the appearance of an enormous lantern. Swinstead Hall, continues Mr. Grange, has fallen somewhat from its high estate in modern times, stripped of its antique furniture, and now, i.e. 1864, occupied by the families of 4 farmers. A giant or enchanter with a rambling ghost or two would be a much more appropriate tenantry. The barns and outhouses clustered around give it quite a singular and unique appearance. A kind of old hobgoblin hall, now somewhat fallen to decay, with weather stains upon the wall, and stairways worn, and crazy doors, and creaking and uneven floors, and chimneys huge and tall. A region of repose, it seems, a place of slumber and of dreams, remote among the wooded hills, for there no noisy railway speeds, in torch race, scattering smoke and gleeds. But noon and night the parting teams stop under the great oaks that throw tangles of light and shade below on roofs and doors and window-sills. Singular to relate, continues Mr. Grange, there is no road to this house deserving of the name, the principal carriage road being a mere random trackway across the unenclosed common, so that it may be said to be isolated from the world, or rather to form a little old-fashioned world of its own. There is, as might be guessed, a strange, weird legend connected with this old, out-of-the-way dwelling, and it is generally told, says Mr. Grange, in the following way. The builder of the hall was a man of the name of Robinson, who, in his youth, was a poor weaver, and resided in a humble cottage near where the hall now stands. The cottage, now doing duty as a cow-house, yet remains to vouch for the truth of the story. This young man left his humble home, travelled to London at a time when the plague was raging in that city, when death had left many houses totally uninhabited and desolate, wherein no survivors were left to bury the dead, and no heirs to claim their wealth. Our North Country adventurer, seeing this state of things, not forgetting himself amid the general mourning and confusion, took possession of the gold thus left without an owner, to such an extent that he loaded a wagon and team of horses with the wealth thus acquired, with which he returned homeward, and in due time again reached the place of his birth. But the story of the plague had reached the place as soon as himself and his gold, and none of his former neighbours would admit him into their dwellings for fear of contagion. So he took up his abode in a barn, which still remains. In order to cleanse his gold from any infectious taint which might possibly cling to it, Robinson washed the whole carefully in the Greenwell spring, which well yet remains, bearing the same name. With the wealth thus acquired, he purchased the estate and built the hall at Swinsty. For a considerable period, many generations of Robinsons enjoyed the property, until, at last, it passed by marriage to the Bramleys, who still enjoy it, or did quite recently. But, according to popular faith, the founder of the family, the original possessor of the hall, cannot cleanse himself so readily as he did his gold from its contamination. His troubled spirit still haunts the old spot. At certain times, those who are gifted with the faculty of seeing apparitions may behold that of Robinson bending over the Greenwell spring, and striving to cleanse his strangely acquired coin even more spectral than himself. There he bends, and rubs, and rubs, and rubs away at his ghastly spoil, and never seems satisfied that it is freed from its taint, or perhaps from its stains. Who knows?
Section 137, Sykes Lub Farm. In a secluded dell on the banks of Mellor Brook, says Mr. T. Wilkinson, not far from the famous Old Hall of Samlesbury, near Blackburn, a haunted old hall, whereof an account will be found in these pages, stands a lonely farmhouse, which was occupied for many generations by a family named Sykes. They gave their name to the homestead, or vice versa, on its being cleared from the forest, and from the fact of the pastures lying at a short distance from a broad and deep portion of the brook. It became generally known by the name of Sykes Lum Farm. This Sykes family, however, as Mr. Wilkinson records, have long since passed to dust, and many generations of strangers have dwelt on their lands. But the doings of one particular member of the race have been handed down, from year to year, by tradition, and still exercise a potent influence upon the minds of the surrounding population. Before referring to the especial tradition for which Sykes Lub Farm is noted, it may be as well to point out that it possesses an uncanny reputation for a supernatural inhabitant, other than the apparition from which its fame is chiefly derived. In one work by Mr. Wilkinson, it is referred to as the residence of a noted boggart, or domestic familiar, in these terms. When in good humour, this noted goblin will milk the cows, pull the hay, fodder the cattle, harness the horses, load the carts, and stack the crops. When irritated by the utterance of some unguarded expression or mock disrespect, either from the farmer or his servants, the cream mugs are then smashed to atoms. No butter can be obtained by churning. The horses and other cattle are turned loose or driven into the woods. 2 cows will sometimes be found fastened in the same stall. No hay can be pulled from the mow, and all the while the wicked imp sits grinning with delight upon one of the crossbeams in the barn. At other times the horses are unable to draw the empty carts across the farmyard. If loaded, they are upset, whilst the cattle tremble with fear without any visible cause, nor do the inmates of the house experience any better or gentler usage. During the night the clothes are said to be violently torn from off the beds of the offending parties, whilst, by invisible hands, they themselves are dragged down the stone stairs by the legs, one step at a time, after a most uncomfortable manner. The way in which this boggart is described as haunting Sykes Lub Farm is in no way out of the common, especially in Lancashire and the neighbouring counties. But it is of interest in this case as showing the popular belief that the place is troubled in some way. In what way the house and grounds are really believed to be, or until recently to have been, haunted, is thus described in Roby and Wilkinson's Lancashire Legends and William Dobson's Rambles by the Riddle. In the days when the farm was owned by old Sykes and his wife, careful living and more than ordinary thrift enabled the old couple to gather together a fair amount of wealth, which, added to the continual hoarding of the farmer's ancestor, caused the pair to be regarded as wonderfully rich in those days. Whatever the facts as to their wealth may have been, they saw its possession ultimately jeopardized by civil troubles and national famine. It was their chief, if not their only object of affection, as they had neither son nor daughter, nor any other object upon which to expend their love. Therefore, the risk of losing it gave them more than ordinary anxiety. Old Sykes does not appear to have clung to the darling hoard with half the affection displayed by his worthy consort. Her dread of losing it was intense. Besides, says our chief authority, she had no notion of becoming dependent upon the bounty of the southwest of the Hall, nor did she relish the idea of soliciting charity at the gates of the lordly abbot of Whalley. The treasure was therefore carefully secured in earthenware jars, and was then buried deep beneath the roots of an apple tree in the orchard. Years passed away, and the troubles of the country did not cease. The Yorkists at length lost the ascendancy, and the reins of the government passed into the hands of the Lancastrians, until at last the northern feud was healed by the mingling of the white rose with the red. Henry VII sat upon the throne with Elizabeth of York as queen, but ere peace thus blessed the land, old Sykes had paid the debt of nature and left his widow the sole possessor of their buried wealth. She too soon passed away, and as the legend asserts, so suddenly that she had no opportunity to disclose the place where she had deposited their treasure. Rumor had not failed to give her the credit of being possessed of considerable wealth, but although her relatives made diligent search, they were unsuccessful in discovering the place of the hidden jars. The farm passed into other hands, and old Sykes's wife might have been forgotten, had not her ghost, unable to find rest, continued occasionally to visit the old farmhouse. Many a time, in the dusk of the evening, have the neighbouring peasants met an old wrinkled woman, dressed in ancient garb, passing along the gloomy road which leads across the Lum. But fear always prevented them from speaking. She never lifted her head, but helped herself noiselessly along by means of a crooked stick, which bore no resemblance to those then in use. At times she was seen in the old barn, on other occasions in the house, but more frequently in the orchard, standing by an apple tree, which still flourished over the place where the buried treasure was afterwards said to have been found. Generations passed away, and still her visits continued. One informant minutely described her withered visage, her short, quaintly cut gown, her striped petticoat, and her stick. He was so much alarmed that he ran away from the place, notwithstanding that he had engaged to perform some urgent work. She was not there, he gravely said, when I went to pluck an apple, but no sooner did I raise my hand towards the fruit than she made her appearance just before me. At last, it is said, an occupier of the farm, when somewhat elated by liquor, ventured to question her as to the reasons of her visits. She returned no answer, but, after moving slowly towards the stump of an old apple tree, she pointed significantly towards a portion of the orchard which had never been disturbed. On search being made, the treasure was found deep down in the earth, and as the soil was being removed, the venerable-looking shade was seen standing on the edge of the trench. When the last jar was lifted out, an unearthly smile passed over her withered features. Her bodily form became less and less distinct, until at last it disappeared altogether. Since then, the old farmhouse has ceased to be haunted. Old Sykes's wife is believed to have found eternal rest. But there are yet many, both old and young, who walk with quickened pace past the Lum whenever they are belated, fearful lest they should be once more confronted with the dreaded form of its unearthly visitor.
Section number 143. Wardley Hall. Many a curious chapter has been written about the human cranium, but probably none more singular than that titled Skull Superstitions by Mr. William Andrews in his work on historic romance. Among other instances of the belief prevalent in certain localities of the way in which skulls influence the fortunes of families, or at any of their residences, he cites the singular and oft referred to case of the empty headpiece kept at Wardley Hall. This ancient pile of buildings, erected in the reign of the 6th Edward, is about 7 miles from Manchester, and is historically noted for its possession of an unburied human skull. The old hall is situated in the midst of a small woody glade, and was originally surrounded by a moat, except on the east side, which was protected by natural defences. In Lancashire Legends, Mr. T. T. Wilkinson says, "This black and white, half-timbered edifice is of a quadrangular form, consisting of ornamented wood and plaster frames, interlined with bricks, plastered and whitewashed, the woodwork being painted black, and entered by a covered archway, opening into a courtyard in the centre, like so many of the manor houses of the same age in Lancashire. About 1830 it was in a ruinous condition, one part being occupied as a farmhouse, and the other formed into a cluster of 9 cottages. The hall has since been thoroughly renovated, and has been occupied for many years by a gentleman farmer and colliery owner. Wardley Hall and the surrounding property, after having been in the possession of various gentle families, in the early part of the 17th century passed into the hands of the Downs, and the hall became the residence of Roger Down. Roger, the grandson of this gentleman, and the heir to the property, is described as one of the most dissolute courtiers of Charles II's court. After a reckless career of crime, this young man, the last male representative of his family, was slain in a drunken brawl, and, says tradition, his head having been severed from his body, was sent as a memento mori to his sister. That head, according to popular faith, has been kept at the hall ever since, none of the tenants having ever been enabled to get rid of it. Mr. Andrews refers to various accounts relating to this noted relic, but quotes, as the most curious, one found in the manuscripts of Thomas Barrett, the Manchester antiquary, describing his own visit to Wardley Hall about the end of the last century. That account it will be well to follow. A human skull which, time out of mind, hath had a superstitious veneration paid to it by the occupiers of the hall, not permitting it to be removed from its situation, which is on the topmost step of a staircase. There is tradition that, if removed or ill-used, some uncommon noise and disturbance always follows, to the terror of the whole house. Yet I cannot persuade myself this is always the case. But some years ago, I and 3 of my acquaintances went to view this surprising piece of household furniture, and found it as above mentioned, and bleached white with weather that beats in upon it from a 4-square window in the hall, which the tenants never permit to be glazed or filled up, thus to oblige the skill which, they say, is unruly and disturbed at the hole not being always open. However, one of us, who was last in company with the skull, removed it from its place into a dark part of the room, and then left and returned home. But the night but one following, such a storm arose about the house, of wind and lightning, as tore down some trees and unthatched outhousing. We hearing of this, my father went over in a few days after to see his mother, who lived near the hall, and was witness to the wreck the storm had made. Yet all this might have happened had the skull never been removed, but withal it keeps alive the credibility of its believers. What I can learn of the above affair from old people in the neighbourhood is that a young man of the Downs family, being in London, one night in his frolics, vowed to his companions that he would kill the first man he met, and accordingly he ran his sword through a man immediately, a tailor by trade. However, justice overtook him in his career of wickedness, for in some while after, he being in a riot upon London Bridge, a watchman made a stroke at him with his bill and severed his head from his body, which head was enclosed in a box, and sent to his sister, who then lived at Wardley, where it hath continued ever since. Roby, in his Traditions of Lancashire, refers to this Wardley legend. After relating the fate of young Downes and the sending home of his decapitated head, he says, "The skull was removed, secretly at first, but invariably it returned to the hall, and no human power could drive it thence. It hath been riven to pieces, burnt, and otherwise destroyed, but on the subsequent day it was seen filling its wonted place." Elsewhere he relates that at Wardley a human skull is still shown here, which is usually kept in a little locked recess in the staircase wall, and which the occupiers of the hall would never permit to be removed. This grim caput mortuum being, it is said, much averse to any change of place or position, never failed to punish the individual severely which should dare to lay hands upon it with any such purpose. If removed, drowned in the neighboring pond, which is in fact a part of the old moat which formerly surrounded the house, or buried, it was sure to return, so that in the end each succeeding tenant was fain to endure its presence, rather than be subject to the terrors and annoyances consequent upon its removal. Even the square aperture in the wall was not permitted to be glazed without the skull, or its long-defunct owner, creating some disturbance. It was almost bleached white by exposure to the weather, and many curious persons have made a pilgrimage there, even of late years. In Harland and Wilkinson's Lancashire Legends, a quite recent work, the editor says that when he visited the hall some years ago, he found that a locked door concealed at once the square aperture and its fearful tenant. At that time 2 keys were provided for this place of a skull, one being kept by the tenant of the hall, and the other by the Countess of Ellesmere, the owner of the property. Occasionally the Countess would accompany visitors from the neighboring Worsley Hall, and would unlock the door and show to her friends the Wardley Hall skull. Mr. Wilkinson revisited the quaint old residence in 1861, and again personally inspected this strange relic of mortality. An account of this reinspection is given in the volume above referred to.
Section 144, Bath. Bath is veritably honeycombed, even in these realistic days, with inexplicable mysteries. Haunted houses are of common occurrence in Bladud City, and there are now before us several cases of ghostly doings therein, which, for reasons pecuniary or personal, the owners or tenants deprecate direct allusion to. Amongst its haunted houses is Jervis House, described as a handsome country seat, possessed of a traditional ghost, and as a building about 2 centuries old, standing in extensive grounds, within which is a large ornamental lake, with a treeless island in the centre of it. A gentleman who was on a visit for the first time at Jervis House a year or 2 ago, says this writer, observed to his host at breakfast, "I see there is no bridge accommodation with your little island." "None." "I thought, too, you told me you had at present no boat on the lake." "Nor have I," replied his friend. "Why?" "How, then, do ladies effect the passage?" The host hesitated. "Ladies?" he repeated. "Do you mean—" "I mean, my good friend, that I noticed a lady walking on the island this morning, so early that I wondered at her fancy. She passed entirely round, and crossed it twice, so that I could not possibly be mistaken." "You have seen the Jervis ghost," said his friend curtly, and the subject was dismissed. Of course, this is a very tantalizing finale, but all our efforts to obtain any further information for the benefit of our readers about Jervis House or its ghostly tenant have proved fruitless. Another narrative, told in the same number of the periodical cited, refers to another haunted residence in the vicinity of Bath, and is, if equally inexplicable, certainly more blood-curdling. It relates to Barton Hall, and the circumstances are asserted by its narrator to be perfectly true, and to have occurred but a very short time since, 1868, to 2 young ladies, sisters, from whom the facts were derived on the occasion of their visit to the hall. They had retired, says the account, to the chamber occupied by both, and the elder sister was already in bed. The younger was kneeling before the fire. The door opened softly, and a woman, entering, crossed the apartment and bent down before a chest of drawers, as if intending to open the lower one. Thinking it was one of the maids, the young lady who was in bed accosted her. "Is that you, Mary? What are you looking for there?" Her sister, who was before the fire, had risen to her feet and turned towards the woman. In the act she uttered a loud shriek, and, staggering back, fell half fainting on the bed. The others sprang up and followed the intruder, who seemed to retreat quickly into an adjoining dressing-room. The young lady entered. It was empty. Returning to her sister, the latter, who had recovered from her consternation, explained the cause of her outcry. The woman, in turning to meet her, displayed a human countenance, but devoid of eyes.
Section number 145. Boland. One of those singular dreams which have attained to historic importance, as much by their recorder's position as their own inexplicable nature, is given in a note to the Antiquary by Sir Walter Scott himself. In vouching for the entire authenticity of the story, Sir Walter states that it was told to him by persons who had the best access to know the facts, who were not likely themselves to be deceived, and who were certainly incapable of deception. He was, therefore, as he remarks of the story, unable to refuse to give it credit, however extraordinary the circumstances may appear. Sir Walter's version of the story, with the names of which he gives only the initials and final letters duly filled in, is Mr. Rutherford of Boland, a gentleman of landed property in the Vale of Gala, was prosecuted for a very considerable sum, the accumulated arrears of tiend, or tithe, for which he was said to be indebted to a noble family, the titulars, lay improprietors of the tithes. Mr. Rutherford was strongly impressed with the belief that his father had, by a form of process peculiar to the law of Scotland, purchased these tiendes from the titular, and therefore that the present prosecution was groundless. But after an industrious search among his father's papers, an investigation among the public records, and a careful inquiry among all persons who had transacted law business for his father, no evidence could be recovered to support his defense. The period was now near at hand when he conceived the loss of his lawsuit to be inevitable, and he had formed the determination to ride to Edinburgh the next day, and make the best bargain he could in the way of compromise. He went to bed with this resolution, and, with all the circumstances of the case floating upon his mind, had a dream to the following purpose. His father, who had been dead many years, appeared to him, he thought, and asked him why he was disturbed in his mind. In dreams men are not surprised at such apparitions. Mr. Rutherford thought that he informed his father of the cause of his distress, adding that the payment of a considerable sum of money was the most unpleasant to him, because he had a strong consciousness that it was not due, though he was unable to recover any evidence in support of his belief. "You are right, my son," replied the paternal shade. "I did acquire right to these tiendes, for payment of which you are now prosecuted. The papers relating to the transaction are in the hands of Mr. Blank, a writer or attorney who is now retired from professional business, and resides at Inveresk, near Edinburgh. He was a person whom I employed on that occasion for a particular reason, but who never on any other occasion transacted business on my account. It is very possible," pursued the vision, "that Mr. Blank may have forgotten a matter which is now of a very old date, but you may call it to his recollection by this token, that, when I came to pay his account, there was difficulty in getting change for a Portugal piece of gold, and we were forced to drink out the balance at a tavern." Mr. Rutherford awoke in the morning, and all the words of the vision imprinted on his mind, and thought it worth while to walk across the country to Inveresk, instead of going straight to Edinburgh. When he came there he waited on the gentleman mentioned in the dream, a very old man. Without saying anything of the vision, he inquired whether he ever remembered having conducted such a matter for his deceased father. The old gentleman could not, at first, bring the circumstance to his recollection, but on mention of the Portugal piece of gold, the whole returned upon his memory. He made an immediate search for the papers and recovered them, so that Mr. Rutherford carried to Edinburgh the documents necessary to gain the cause which he was on the verge of losing.
Section 146. Clifton Park. In Horace Welby's Signs Before Death, a work to which we have elsewhere had occasion to refer, the following narrative is given, and in these words. One morning in the summer of 1745, Mrs. Jane Lowe, housekeeper to Mr. Pringle of Clifton Park, in the south of Scotland, beheld the apparition of a lady walking in the avenue, on the margin of a rivulet which runs into Cale Water. The form resembled a daughter of her master, who had long been absent from the family, at the distance of about 100 miles south of Paris. As Mrs. Lowe walked down the avenue and approached the rivulet, this resemblance impressed her so strongly that, seeing her master in an enclosure adjoining, she went and told him what she had seen. Mr. Pringle laughed and said, "You simple woman, that lady is Miss Chatto of Moorbattle." However, Mrs. Lowe prevailed upon him to accompany her to the place, which they had nearly reached, when the apparition sprang into the water and instantly disappeared. Mr. Pringle and Mrs. Lowe, on returning to the hall, apprised the family of the vision, and for their pains were heartily laughed at. The Reverend Mr. Turnbull, minister at Linton, happened to breakfast that morning with Mr. Pringle, his lady, and 2 young daughters, who joined in the laugh. About 3 months afterwards, the same reverend gentleman honoured the family with his company. When standing at a window in the lower room, he observed a poor, ragged, lame, lean man approaching the house. "Here comes another apparition," cried Mr. Turnbull, with a kind of contemptuous smile. This drew the immediate attention of all present, and Mr. Pringle quickly recognised the person to be his second son, who he had not seen for above 10 years. On his arrival, he soon convinced them that he was not an apparition, declaring that he had narrowly escaped with his life from Tunis, in the vicinity which he had been a slave to the Algerines 7 years, but had happily been ransomed at the critical moment when he was ordered to be put to death for mutiny. He added that on his return home through France he called at the place where he had heard that his sister resided, and to his unspeakable grief found that she had died on the 25th of May, the same summer, about 5 o'clock in the morning, which he recollected to have been the precise time when he was saved from the jaws of death, and when he thought he beheld his sister. Mrs. Lowe, who was present in the room, on hearing his declaration, added her testimony by affirming that the day alluded to was that on which she had shown Mr. Pringle the apparition, and this was confirmed by the Reverend Mr. Turnbull, in whose study this narrative was found after his death.